I used to believe that family dinners were sacred, that no matter how strained life became, the table could still be a place of peace. I clung to that belief the way a drowning woman clings to driftwood, even when the ocean has already decided she won't make it to shore. My name is Emily. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my marriage I have lived in the quiet shadow of a woman who made me doubt the goodness in people, my mother-in-law Margaret. When I first met her, she smiled so sweetly that even the waiter at the cafe complimented us, saying we looked like mother and daughter. I remember blushing, and she tilted her head and said, "Oh, not yet." That was the day she offered me her approval, like a gift, one that came with invisible strings. Back then, I was naive enough to believe love could melt hostility. My husband Daniel was her only son, tall, gentle, the kind of man who always apologized even when he wasn't at fault. We met at a charity gala, and from that night on, he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. When he proposed, Margaret congratulated us with champagne and perfect teeth. But even in her hug, I felt the stiffness of performance, as though she were embracing a rival, not a future daughter. Our wedding was beautiful, but her words after the ceremony stayed with me more than any photograph. She leaned in, kissed my cheek, and whispered, "Let's hope you can keep him happy." It wasn't a blessing, it was a test. For the first year I tried. I tried harder than I should have. I smiled through every backhanded compliment, every suggestion that I wasn't refined enough for her son. She'd show up unannounced at our house with bags of groceries, things she knew I didn't cook with, and make comments like, "It's good you have me to help you feed him properly." Daniel always brushed it off. "She's just old-fashioned," he'd say. "She means well." And I wanted to believe him, because love in its early years thrives on denial. But then Margaret found out we couldn't have children. That was the turning point, the moment her tolerance turned into quiet contempt. I'll never forget the day the doctor told us the results. The problem wasn't mine. It was Daniel's. He took it with grace, but she didn't. "My son's fine," she said flatly when she found out, her voice trembling with something uglier than anger. "It's you. You must have done something wrong. Women ruin their bodies these days." I remember the way Daniel froze, torn between defending me and pacifying her. He chose silence. And silence is louder than any insult when it comes from someone you love. The months that followed were a slow unraveling of peace. Margaret began planting seeds, subtle things at first. "You look pale, Emily. Are you eating properly, or you seem distracted lately? Men notice that, you know." Then came the dinners. Every Sunday, she'd invite us, and no matter how I tried to decline, she'd insist. "Family time is sacred," she'd say, her lips curling just enough to make me question whether she believed her own words. Her husband Richard was her opposite kind, quiet, the kind of man who'd refill your glass before you even realized it was empty. He'd wink at me sometimes when Margaret got too sharp, as if to say, "I know what she's like. Just endure it." I endured it for years. Until one night, one dinner changed everything. It started like any other evening at their grand old house, with its white columns and roses that never seemed to wilt. The table was already set when we arrived. Margaret was in rare form, charming, composed, humming softly as she stirred something on the stove. She kissed Daniel on the cheek and ignored me entirely. That was her newest habit, pretending I wasn't there. Dinner began with polite conversation. She asked about Daniel's work, then turned to me with a look that could slice glass. "And you, Emily, still doing your little freelance writing?" She said little, as if my words were child's play, as if storytelling were a toy, not a craft. I smiled politely. "Yes, still writing. I just finished a piece on resilience." "Ah," she said, sipping her wine. "How ironic." The others laughed, not because it was funny, but because she'd trained them to. I looked at Daniel. He lowered his eyes, ashamed but silent. Then came dessert. Chocolate mousse, my favorite. She insisted I have a full serving even when I declined. "You're too thin," she said sweetly. "You need to take better care of yourself." Something about her tone made the hairs on my neck rise. The glass in front of me, the wine she'd poured earlier, shimmered oddly under the chandelier light. I couldn't explain why, but my instincts screamed, "Don't drink that." So I didn't. Not immediately. I smiled, lifted it slowly, and said, "You know what, Margaret? You've worked so hard tonight. You deserve this more than anyone." And before she could stop me, I swapped glasses with her husband Richard. He chuckled nervously. "Well, if the lady insists." He drank. Margaret froze. Just for a second, her mask cracked, a flicker of pure, unfiltered panic flashing across her face. Then she tried to hide it with laughter, but her hand trembled as she reached for the breadbasket. It happened 20 minutes later. Richard excused himself from the table, said he felt dizzy. Margaret followed her voice unnaturally high, insisting he was just tired. But the sound of something crashing in the hallway silenced us all. Daniel leapt up. I followed. Richard was on the floor, pale, sweating, struggling to breathe. Margaret knelt beside him, her face ghost white, her hands trembling too hard to help. The paramedics arrived quickly. I don't even remember who called them, and the next thing I knew, we were in the hospital. The smell of disinfectant thick in the air. The doctor came out after what felt like hours. He's stable, he said, but there was something strange in his system. A sedative, very strong. Daniel turned to his mother. What did you give him? He demanded. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed again. It must have been a mistake, she stammered. The kitchen staff, maybe they… There are no staff, Daniel snapped. You cooked everything yourself. Her eyes darted to me, then a flicker of blame, of accusation, but she didn't speak it aloud. Not yet. When we got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that look in her eyes when I switched the glasses, that split second of fear. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. She knew what was in that drink. The next morning, I went to the hospital to check on Richard. He was awake, fragile, but lucid. When he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. I don't understand, he whispered. Why would she… I took his hand gently. I think she meant it for me. He closed his eyes and one tear slipped down his cheek. I always feared it would come to this, he murmured. She's not well, Emily. She's been unwell for years. That was when he told me the truth, the one no one else knew. Margaret had once been institutionalized years before Daniel was born. Depression, paranoia, an overdose that nearly killed her. She'd hidden it, built a life of control and perfection to bury it deep. She lives in fear of losing things, he said softly. Of losing people. That's why she hates you. You took Daniel's love, her last possession. I left the hospital trembling. Part of me pitied her, but another part, the part she'd tried to destroy for years, burned with cold fury. Because if she'd succeeded that night, I would have been a headline. A tragedy with a polite obituary. And she would have cried crocodile tears at my funeral, whispering, such a shame. She never took care of herself. But fate had turned the glass, not mercy, and I wasn't done. Not yet. The next few days blurred into one long ache, part exhaustion, part disbelief. Daniel was torn between protecting his mother and facing what she had done. Every hour brought a new tension. Hospital calls, murmured conversations, my husband's pale face pressed into his hands as he tried to make sense of a family he no longer recognized. I wanted to comfort him, but something inside me had gone cold. Compassion used to be my default. Now it felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I'd lived for years believing patience could heal anything. That kindness would soften cruelty if only I kept offering it. But when someone poisons you, not just your body, but your peace, your name, your marriage, the kindness in you curdles. It turns into something sharper. That's what happened to me after the night of the dinner. Every glance in the mirror felt different. My eyes were no longer pleading for approval. They were calculating, waiting. Margaret called 2 days later. Daniel took the call first. I watched him from across the kitchen, his voice low, his words cautious. Yes, Mom. I know, but… No, Emily's fine. His tone cracked slightly on my name. I could hear her voice through the phone, frantic, trembling, desperate to rewrite history. When he hung up, he looked at me as though I might break. She says she didn't mean it, that it was some kind of medication mix-up. I stared at him, trying to find the man I used to know. Do you believe her? He hesitated too long. And in that pause, I understood everything I needed to. The next morning, I went to the police. I didn't tell Daniel. The detective listened carefully as I described the dinner, the swap, the collapse, the hospital diagnosis. His questions were precise. His pen didn't stop moving. Do you have proof the drink was meant for you? He asked finally. I have her eyes, I said quietly. That's enough for me. He nodded, but didn't promise justice. The law needs evidence. I only had instinct. But instinct is a woman's inheritance, and mine had never failed me. Still, I left with a hollow sense of defeat. I'd done the right thing, and somehow it felt like nothing at all. That night, I found Daniel sitting on the edge of our bed, his face buried in his hands. He looked older than his years. They're keeping her for observation, he said. She's had another breakdown. The doctor said she's not stable. My heart twisted. Stable enough to cook? Stable enough to hate me? Stable enough to plan something like that? My voice trembled not with fear but with disbelief at how calmly I could say it. He looked up, his eyes red. I don't know what to do. She's my mother, Emily. And I'm your wife, I said softly, the one she tried to erase. We didn't speak for a long time after that. The silence became a third presence in our marriage, heavy, observant, judging us both. Weeks passed. Richard was released from the hospital, weaker but alive. I visited him often, more out of guilt than duty. He'd look at me with those weary eyes filled with apology for something that wasn't his fault. You remind me of the woman she used to be, he said once, before the anger settled in her bones. I wanted to ask him what broke her, what turned love into poison, but maybe some questions don't have answers, only echoes. Margaret stayed in the psychiatric ward for nearly a month. When she was released, Daniel insisted we visit her together. She's remorseful, he said. She wants to apologize. I didn't go for forgiveness. I went to see what remorse looked like on her face. She sat in the garden of the rehabilitation center, wrapped in a cream shawl that matched the color of her lies, soft, comforting, and suffocating. When she saw me, her eyes filled instantly with tears. Emily, she said, reaching for my hand. My sweet girl. I don't know what came over me. I wasn't myself. I looked at her fingers, the same hands that had stirred the poisoned wine, and felt no warmth. You've said that before, I replied. Every time you've hurt someone, you've said you weren't yourself. Maybe this is who you are. Her lip trembled. You hate me. No, I said, I understand you, that's worse. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Shame, fear, maybe both. Then she leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. You don't know everything, Emily. There are things Daniel hasn't told you. Things about his father. And about you. I stiffened. What do you mean? She smiled faintly like a cat that had just spotted a wounded bird. Richard's not the only one who almost died for love. Ask Daniel what happened 10 years ago before you met him. The nurse came then, wheeling her away, and I stood there frozen. Every instinct screamed lie. Yet her words lodged in me like a splinter under the skin. You can't stop thinking about a splinter. You can't stop touching it even when it hurts. That night I waited for Daniel to come home. He looked exhausted, drained from his visits to the hospital and his half-hearted attempts to pretend our life was normal again. I poured 2 glasses of wine, not poison, just symbolic, because sometimes what kills a marriage isn't venom, but silence. I slid his glass across the table. What happened 10 years ago? His expression faltered. What are you talking about? Your mother said there's something I should know. Something about your father. About you. He rubbed his temples the way he always did when he was buying time. She's confused, Emily. She's mixing up the past again. Then explain it to me, I said quietly, before I start believing her. The silence stretched until it felt like a living thing between us. Then he spoke barely above a whisper. 10 years ago, there was an accident. My mother found out my father was having an affair with one of his students. It ended badly. How badly? She died, he said. The girl. My father swore it was an overdose, but my mother always believed he caused it. She tried to confront him that night. He pushed her. She hit her head. The police called it a domestic dispute, but they sealed the records because of his reputation. I stared at him. You knew all this and never told me. I wanted to protect you from it, he said. From her. My pulse thudded in my ears. And now she's done the same thing, tried to erase someone else. Me. The cycle didn't stop, Daniel. You just handed me to her. Me. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. That's not fair. Neither is surviving your own murder, I said, my voice shaking. And that's what she tried to do. He left the room, then not slamming the door, just closing it softly. That's how guilt leaves quietly so it can come back later. That night, I lay awake thinking about cycles, how families pass their poison down like heirlooms, polishing it until it looks like love. Margaret had learned control from her father. Daniel had learned avoidance from his mother. And I I had learned endurance. But endurance without boundaries is just a slower kind of dying. The next morning, I called the detective again. I remembered something I said. The wine bottle. She handled it before dinner. They reopened the investigation. This time they took samples from the bottle I'd secretly kept, a small act of paranoia that turned into salvation. The results came back clear traces of zopiclone, a powerful sedative mixed with alcohol. Enough to kill a grown woman if she drank it all. When the police questioned her again, she didn't deny it. She said she wasn't thinking clearly. She said she just wanted Emily to rest. They called it diminished responsibility. I called it attempted murder. The court hearings were quiet, clinical. She was ordered back into treatment, no prison, just years of psychiatric supervision. Daniel sat beside me through every session, his hand trembling in mine. But by the end, I no longer recognized his touch. It felt like something I'd outgrown. After the verdict, Margaret was led away, frail and expressionless. As she passed me, she whispered, "You'll regret this. You don't know what you've started." Maybe she was right. Because vengeance once awakened doesn't stop when justice is served. It keeps walking behind you, barefoot, waiting. And I wasn't done walking yet. The months that followed were strangely quiet, the kind of silence that sits too close, breathing against your ear. People think that justice brings peace, but it doesn't. It brings clarity, and clarity is heavier than grief. Once the trial ended, everyone expected me to move on, to let the story fade the way all scandals eventually do. But what no one understood was that the story wasn't over. Because Margaret had planted something in me far worse than fear. She'd planted curiosity. There were things she said during her breakdown that didn't leave me. "You don't know what Daniel's father did," she'd hissed once in the hospital garden. And after hearing about that girl, the student who died years ago, I couldn't stop wondering. Richard always seemed so kind, so gentle. But kindness can be a disguise. I'd learned that lesson too well. One morning I visited him again. The nurses at the assisted living home smiled when they saw me. "He asks about you every day," one said. I nodded politely and followed her down the hallway, lined with pastel paintings of trees that never looked alive. Richard sat by the window, a book open on his lap, sunlight washing his frail hands in gold. He looked smaller, like guilt had been slowly folding him inward. "Emily," he said softly, looking up, "you came." I had questions, I said, sitting beside him. "About 10 years ago. About the girl." He flinched, eyes flickering to the nurse, then back to me. "You've spoken to Margaret. She said there was more to the story. Was she lying?" He sighed, closing the book. "Margaret never lies," he said after a moment. "She just edits the truth until it fits her version of love." "What's your version?" I asked. He looked out the window, his voice trembling. "The girl's name was Hannah. She wasn't my student, but she worked for me. She was very young. Margaret found out after a year. There was a fight. I told her it was over, but it wasn't. Hannah got pregnant." The room tilted around me. "Pregnant. She wanted to keep it," he said quietly. "But Margaret found out. She called her, told her to disappear, offered her money to go abroad. Hannah refused. The next day she was gone. The police said suicide, but—" He paused. "I've never believed it." "Do you think Margaret—" "I don't know," he whispered. "But after that she changed. She began seeing ghosts in mirrors, whispering to people who weren't there. When Daniel was born, she swore she'd never let anyone take him from her again." The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest. "So she spent her life keeping him chained by guilt," I said bitterly. He nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "And I let her. Because I thought it was penance." When I left the home, the world outside felt distorted, too bright, too loud. I sat in the car for almost an hour, staring at my hands. They looked steady, but something inside me wasn't. Margaret hadn't just tried to kill me. She'd tried to reenact her entire tragedy. In her mind, I wasn't Emily. I was Hannah, the woman who stole her husband, the woman she couldn't control. That night, I told Daniel everything. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, pale and silent, his eyes distant. "I don't believe it," he said finally. "Dad would never—" He told me himself. I interrupted. "She wasn't lying, Daniel. She was haunted. And maybe she passed that madness down to you in smaller doses, the part that keeps you from ever standing up to her." He slammed his hands against the table. Don't you dare say that. I just did, I said quietly, because I'm done whispering in a house that only listens to ghosts. That night, I packed a bag. No fight, no shouting, just the soft rustle of leaving. I moved into a small apartment across town, the kind of place where the pipes groan and the neighbors argue through the walls. But for the first time in years, I could breathe. Still, freedom doesn't erase memory. Every night I dreamt of that dinner, the gleam of the poisoned glass, the trembling in Margaret's hand, the silence that followed. But sometimes in those dreams, the person drinking it wasn't Richard. It was me. I'd wake up gasping, my throat burning, the taste of metal on my tongue. Then one evening, 6 months after the verdict, I received a letter. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting unmistakable, slanted, elegant, controlled. Margaret Sullivan. My hands shook as I opened it. The first line made me freeze. You took my son. Now you will learn what it means to be alone. There was no return address, just a faint scent of her perfume, the same lavender she used to wear at dinners. My first instinct was fear, but underneath it something colder stirred. She was supposed to be under psychiatric supervision. How could she have written this? I called Daniel immediately. Did you visit your mother recently? No, he said, his voice strained. Why? She sent me a letter. He was silent for a long moment. Then quietly he said, Emily, she's gone. What do you mean gone? She disappeared 3 days ago. They think she walked out during visiting hours. Dad's distraught. I felt my pulse quicken. And you didn't think to tell me. I didn't want to scare you, he said. But I was already scared. That night, I locked every door and window, but sleep didn't come. I kept hearing things, the soft creak of the hallway, the faint hum of the refrigerator turning into whispers. When dawn finally arrived, my phone buzzed with a message. A number I didn't recognize. You switched the glasses, clever girl. I dropped the phone, my heart hammering. The message disappeared seconds later, as if it had deleted itself. I called the police, showed them the letter and what I'd seen. They promised to look into it, which is what people say when they're already too busy. 2 weeks passed. Nothing. No sightings, no arrests. Then one morning, I walked into my apartment kitchen and froze. On my table, wrapped in tissue paper, was a bottle of red wine, the same brand Margaret had served that night. There was a note tied to its neck, a toast to closure. My knees almost gave out. I called the detective, my voice shaking. They took the bottle, fingerprinted it, analyzed it. The results came back the next day, traces of the same sedative, the same poison. She was still out there. But instead of panic, I felt something else rise in me, something that didn't tremble this time. I was done waiting to be hunted. I called Richard. She's contacted me, I said. His voice cracked. Emily, please don't. She's not after me anymore, I interrupted. She's after you. Because you survived what she meant for me. He began to sob quietly, like someone mourning a truth he'd always known would come back. I can't live in fear of her forever, he whispered. Then don't, I said. Help me end this. He hesitated. What are you planning? I looked out the window, the sky bruised with storm clouds. A dinner. One last dinner. The same way it began. I set the table myself that night, arranging every plate, every fork with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. The dining room smelled faintly of lemon oil and old memory, that strange combination of cleanliness and ghosts. I'd chosen the same menu Margaret had made that night months ago, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and her signature chocolate mousse. There was symbolism in repetition, a kind of poetry in circling back to where the wound began. I told Daniel we were having dinner with his father, that I wanted to mend things. He seemed hesitant at first, but the longing for normalcy is a powerful drug, and he agreed. Richard arrived early, as I knew he would, holding a bottle of wine, the same kind of course. You're sure about this? He asked, his voice trembling. Yes, I said softly, setting the glasses. It's time to finish what she started. He looked at me then, and for a moment I saw the weight of his years, the regret that had hollowed him from the inside out. If she comes tonight, she won't be herself, he murmured. She's never been herself, I replied. The plan was simple. The police were stationed 2 blocks away. If she appeared, they'd intervene. I'd given them her handwriting, her perfume, her patterns. But what I didn't tell them was that I'd also left one chair deliberately unguarded, one blind spot in the surveillance. I wanted her to see me first, unprotected. Because revenge doesn't bloom under fluorescent light. It needs shadow to grow. Daniel arrived last. He looked nervous, glancing around the house as though expecting the walls to whisper. "You've really gone to all this trouble," he said weakly. "It feels like old times." "It isn't," I said quietly. He frowned, but before he could reply, there was a sound, soft, deliberate, from the back door. A click. The faint creak of hinges. Every muscle in my body went still. She walked in as if she'd never left. Same cream shawl, same controlled posture, same smile that could slice skin. "Well," she said, her voice honeyed. "Isn't this lovely?" Daniel's breath caught Mother. Margaret's gaze slid past him straight to me. "Emily, I must admit I'm impressed. You've always been good at survival." The air in the room tightened. "You shouldn't be here," Daniel whispered. "I could say the same about your marriage," she replied. Then her eyes flicked to the table, to the 2 glasses of wine gleaming under the chandelier. "You even remembered my favorite vintage." "I remember everything," I said evenly. Richard rose shakily, his face pale. "Margaret, please," he said. "This isn't the way." She turned to him with an expression that was almost tender. "Oh, Richard." Always trying to be the hero after the story's already ended. I watched her hands. They trembled slightly, but not from fear, from excitement. The kind of trembling that happens right before impact. "Sit down," I said. "We can talk." She hesitated, studying me as if calculating the trap. Then she sat. Daniel took the seat beside her, still trying to bridge 2 worlds that could never meet again. "I didn't come here to talk," Margaret said finally. "I came because I wanted to see what kind of woman outlived me." "I didn't outlive you," I said softly. "You killed yourself a long time ago. You just didn't bury the body." Her lips tightened. "You think you've won?" "I don't believe in winning," I said. "Only endings." For a moment, no one moved. The clock on the mantel ticked each second loud enough to count the distance between us. Then slowly she reached for her glass. "Don't," I said. Her eyes gleamed, afraid of what might happen again. I met her gaze steadily. "No, because this time I'm not swapping glasses." A flicker of surprise passed across her face, quick as a shadow. She looked down at the wine, then back at me. "You didn't." "I didn't have to," I said. "The police have been waiting outside since you walked in. They know you spiked the bottle you left at my apartment. Your fingerprints were everywhere." For the first time, her mask slipped. The smile faltered. "You tricked me." "No," I said, leaning forward. "You tricked yourself. You taught me how." The door burst open. Then officers flooding in, voices, sharp commands echoing through the house. Daniel stood frozen, torn between horror and relief. Margaret didn't fight. She simply stared at me, her expression oddly calm. As they led her away, she turned her head one last time. "You've become me," she whispered. I felt something break inside, a truth I didn't want to admit. Because she was right in a way. Revenge changes the temperature of your blood. It makes you colder, sharper, more deliberate. It makes you capable of silence that hurts more than words. The police took her back into custody that night. They said she'd be transferred to a higher security psychiatric facility. Daniel followed the car in silence. Richard stayed behind, sitting at the empty table, staring at the untouched glasses. "You didn't poison her, did you?" he asked softly. I looked at the wine, the crimson light bending through the glass like blood under glass. "No," I said. "But I wanted her to think I might have." He nodded, understanding the cruelty and necessity of that choice. "That's what makes you different from her," he murmured. "Is it?" I asked. He didn't answer. The days that followed felt dreamlike. Margaret's second arrest made the news. Wealthy family matriarch apprehended after poison scandal. Reporters parked outside my building for a week. Some called me brave. Others called me heartless. I didn't care. They hadn't seen what poison does to a person long before it reaches the bloodstream. Daniel moved out soon after. He said he needed distance from his mother, from me, from everything that reminded him of how small his courage had been. I didn't stop him. Love can survive betrayal, but not denial. And he'd been denying the truth long before the poison ever touched a glass. Richard passed away quietly 2 months later. The doctors said it was heart failure. I think it was relief. I attended the funeral alone, standing beneath a gray sky that looked mercifully indifferent. As they lowered the casket, I thought about the dinner table, about all the words that had never been said, and the ones that had burned too deeply to forget. Afterward, I walked home through the drizzle, my shoes soaked, my mind strangely clear. Some stories don't end with justice or forgiveness. They end with survival, raw, unpolished, unapologetic. A year later, I sold the house and moved to the coast. I started writing again, not freelance, not articles, but stories. Stories about women who refused to die quietly. Stories about the elegance of revenge and the cost of peace. My first book became a small success, and sometimes at book signings, women my mother's age would take my hand and whisper, "Thank you for saying what we can't." And yet sometimes at night I still hear Margaret's voice, not accusing, almost wistful. "You've become me." When that happens, I walk to the ocean. I stand where the tide meets the sand and whisper back, "No." I became what you could have been if you'd ever learned to stop hating. Because that's the truth about revenge. It doesn't free you, it refines you. It turns pain into something precise, like glass, transparent, dangerous, and unbreakable. So when people ask me how it felt to survive her, I tell them the truth. It didn't feel like survival. It felt like awakening. And if you're listening to this and you've ever been betrayed by someone who smiled as they broke, you remember this. You can't control what they do to you, but you can control what you become after. Don't become their reflection, become their consequence. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe and tell me in the comments. Would you have forgiven her or watched her fall? End.